Greetings, dear viewers. Today, the guest of the open studio of Svobodная Pressa, which is, of course, the free press, is Paul Craig Roberts, who is a prominent American economist, columnist, blogger, and former civil servant. He served during the Reagan administration as the United States Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Economic Policy. Later on, he wrote, he held positions of editor and columnist for the Wall Street Journal, columnist for Business Week, the Scripps Howard News Service, as well as contributing editor to Harper's Magazine. In 2015, the Mexican Press Club honored Mr. Roberts with its International Award for Excellence in Journalism. Mr. Roberts, welcome to our studio, and good morning, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Roberts, you are well known in Russia and to the readers of the Svobodная Pressa through your articles as a proponent of normal relations between our two countries, between Russia and United States. It takes, I should say, courage to be a proponent of such relations now. How do you evaluate the present day situation in our bilateral relations?
Extremely dangerous. You know, the original Cold War, you had both sides, both Soviet leadership and American presidents working to reduce tensions. There were a series of arms control limitations. You may remember the so-called SALT talks. There was the anti-ballistic missile treaty. There were many efforts to diffuse tensions because of the threat of nuclear annihilation. Well, when the Soviet Union collapsed politically and Yeltsin became the leader of Russia while the Russian Soviet Empire was broken up by the Americans, the threat seemed to disappear because Russia was no longer independent of Washington. And that was the situation during Yeltsin. And it became sort of unbearable for Russia to be turned into another puppet state of the American empire, such as England and France and Germany. And the rise then of Putin, who restored Russian sovereignty. This caused a great deal of alarm in Washington, particularly among the neoconservative elements. They had developed a policy of American unilateralism, and they saw Russia now in a position to act independently. And so the tensions returned as the United States pulled out of arms control agreements, pulled out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, and began a series of accusations against Russia. The downing of the Malaysian airline, the poisoning of the Sherpas in England, Russian invasions of Georgia, Russian invasions of Ukraine. The accusations mounted. The language became less and less diplomatic on the American side, and more provocations, more military maneuvers on Russia's borders, And it got worse and worse until we had Hillary Clinton during the back during the 2016 American presidential campaign, I think it was, referred to President Putin as the new Hitler. And then most recently, we've had this President Biden say that Putin was a killer. Well, no one ever spoke this way during the original Cold War. So the new Cold War is far more dangerous because the people in Washington are doing everything possible to raise the tensions, not to lower them. And we saw what happened to President Trump when he said he wanted to normalize relations with Russia. Whether anyone believes him or not, I do believe that was his intent, and that was the reason for Russiagate. It was an orchestration to prevent him from normalizing relations and to force him into the mode of Russophobia. So we can see that the situation between the two major nuclear powers is much more serious today. And this is entirely the fault of the demand in Washington by the neoconservatives for American hegemony. So Putin and Russia are seen as obstacles that need to be removed in order that there is unilateral unipower hegemony by Washington. This is the critical threat. And the second critical threat is it's not always clear the Kremlin understands that, because that demand for hegemony does not leave any room for peace, for working things out, for getting along. It is a demand, an unconditional demand, that the Kremlin submit to Washington's will.
Sir, sometimes, or not sometimes, perhaps always, people say that Mr. Putin is polite. Some say he's meek and modest. How his line of behavior is perceived or understood in Washington?
Not in the way that Putin hopes. Putin, I think, is a very responsible leader. He doesn't fly off the handle. He doesn't react to provocations in a provocative way, because he understands that there's really no survivors of a nuclear war. He also understands that the Americans and NATO have no prospect of winning a conventional war with Russia. It's simply not, it could not happen. And so a conflict would be nuclear. Otherwise, Washington would have no chance. And so he does everything he can as he sees it to prevent that risk from getting out of hand. Is this a successful policy? I myself have raised doubts about it, because the more you accept accusations and provocations without a firmer response, the result is to encourage more accusations and provocations. And that is what has been the Kremlin's fate. All of their efforts to downplay the conflict and to offer negotiations, offer to get along, offer to restore the dismantled accomplishments of past decades in arms control, these are rejected. Well, my view is that Putin's efforts to be low-key and diplomatic and responsible are interpreted by Washington as weakness, as there's no foot that's come down hard to say, okay, that is enough. Now, in his last address to the Federal Assembly in Russia, he did say, people are always accusing us. It doesn't really matter until they invade us. If they attack us, then we're going to deal with them in a determined, definitive way. Well, this is a very powerful warning, but you see his warnings don't carry conviction in Washington because he never gives anyone a bloody nose. For example, from an American perspective, it appears that Putin protects Israel's attacks on Syrian territory by standing down the S-300s. So why does Syria have them if they can't use them to prevent the Israeli attacks? So perhaps if the next Israeli attack was destroyed, then Putin's warnings would carry meaning. People would say, well, look, we're going too far. We've underestimated what the Russians will tolerate, and we had better find some way to accept that they are here, they're sovereign, and they intend to stay that way. So I don't think Putin's policy has been successful, and I think it encourages more aggressive accusations and more aggressive military maneuvers. What also happens is that the public in the West, in the United States, in Europe, they hear these accusations over and over and over, and they're elevated, and they get stronger. You know, he goes from being a crook to a Hitler to a killer. And this sticks with the public. And it makes it impossible for the publics in Europe and the United States to act as a constraint on their governments, because the common opinion established by the media year after year that Russia is the bad guy, and then if you say, well, we've got to get along with them, then you get called a Russian agent, a Russian dupe. And so that is another unfortunate aspect of Putin being so reasonable, is it lets the Western media build up this image year after year, and it sticks with the public, and it prevents the public from saying, look, we don't want a war. Find out how to get along with Russia, because that then makes them sound like they're Russian agents, and then they face the demonization like President Trump received. So in a way, his reasonableness of Putin has backfired. That's my opinion. And look, you can see this. Let me just quote some of the recent newspaper headlines in the United States. Let me just quote a few of these. Here's the New York Times. All of this is within, say, the last week. New York Times, these are direct quotes. A threat from the Russian state. Ukrainians alarmed as Russian troops mass on their doorstep. Another New York Times, Ukraine's president warns of possible war with Russia. The Washington Post, Russia is expanding offensive military strength near Ukraine border. The Wall Street Journal, my old newspaper. Well, this is a fair one. Russia's Putin issues warnings amid military buildup. Then we have a business publication, the Business Insider. Russia seems to be preparing to invade Ukraine. We have yahoo.com. Is Russia about to invade Ukraine? Newsweek, the exact same headline. Is Russia about to invade Ukraine? The BBC, is Russia going to war with Ukraine? Even the Al Jazeera, will Russia attack Ukraine? The Foreign Policy magazine, this is a magazine of the foreign policy community in America. Russia is preparing to go to war in Ukraine. These go on and on. Newsweek, speculation grows whether Moscow intends to invade Ukraine. Here is, again, another business magazine. Putin has ordered thousands of troops to the Russian border with Ukraine and mounted a sea blockade. They go on to say, it looks as if Putin is planning to invade. It's endless. So that's what people hear, and they hear day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. And so you can see how this immobilizes public opinion from taking a stance for good relations with Russia.
Then what could be done to, okay, in Russian we also have a saying, so to say, that unpunished crime breeds more crime, or invites more crime, or the crime becomes brazen-faced. What can be done to, if not prevent, but maybe to diffuse the existing tensions, or at least to do something to show that these accusations are wrong?
Well, I think that's the mistake the Kremlin has made, trying to show the accusations are wrong. Because Washington doesn't care. The Washington knows the accusations are wrong. They know they're wrong. Facts don't matter. What the Kremlin doesn't seem to understand is all of this is part of a campaign against Russia. You know, facts don't matter for war propaganda. In war propaganda, you do everything you possibly can to demonize the enemy. You know, we still understand World War II against the Germans in terms of the war propaganda. That's the way we understand it. Well, that's what's happening now. It's not, the facts don't matter. This is where the Kremlin goes wrong. They keep saying, let's examine the facts, we'll help. You know, they wanted to participate in the investigation of the downing of the Malaysian airliner. Well, there wasn't an investigation. Washington didn't want an investigation. You know, they wanted to see the evidence of the Skripals. They wanted to see the evidence of Navalny. Well, but you see, there isn't any evidence. There's just accusations, and they're not interested in the facts. Washington knows the facts are made up, and it's a mistake for the Kremlin to think that Washington is just misreading the evidence. Washington is using false charges to discredit Russia in the minds of the Western populations. So what can they do? Well, it seems to me there's only two alternatives. Either the Kremlin needs simply to ignore the accusations and say nothing, and just turn its back on the West and go about its business with China in the East and with other parts of the world who understand that Russia is a well-meaning entity and a powerful entity, and that it's sensible to be on good terms. So they should just go ahead with China and create their own world and simply ignore the West. In many ways, the West is in a state of collapse, moral collapse, political, economic. And so the desire of the part of so many Russian intellectuals to be part of the West is nonsensical, because the West is a moral wasteland. It's politically exhausted. Presidential elections are stolen. Courts never deliver justice. It's the antithesis of what Putin represents Russia wants to be. So what I think one of Russia's greatest problems is that during the Yeltsin era, the Americans succeeded in brainwashing the Russian academicians and the Russian intellectuals. If you look at the Russian academicians, particularly those in foreign policy and economics, they're essentially got one foot in the West. They're more Western than they are Russian. And it's like a fifth column. And it may be that it's the influence of these people why the Kremlin never can make a firm break and realize that there's no chance of coming to terms with the West, and simply turn its back and go about its business elsewhere. That's one alternative. I think that alternative is blocked by what we call the Russian Atlanticist integrationists. They want so much to be part of the West that they sacrifice Russian interests. That's my reading of those people in Russia. The other alternative for the Kremlin is simply to find an opportunity to take very firm action where they're clearly in the right that isn't enough to set off a war. For example, in Washington, in fact, you could say this in the foreign policy community in the United States, Russia's acceptance of the continued Israeli and sometimes American attacks on Syrian territory is a puzzle. Why did the Russians go in militarily to rescue the country and then sit there and let Israel attack it? And it's a firm belief here that Russia has stood down the Syrian use of the S-300s. So why does Syria have them? So what I think would send a good message and would certainly bloody a nose would be the next time there's an Israeli attack on Syria, that the Russians simply let the Syrians use the S-300s and defeat the attack and blow up the Israeli airplanes. Simply that then shows, okay, there is a limit after all, but it's something the Syrians did. The Russians not going to do it. They're just going to stop preventing the Syrians from using their equipment. It'd be something Syria did in self-protection. Everyone would know that Russians had given its approval. And so this would send a message, well, look, they're not going to take any more. We'd better find some other way. So those are my suggestions. Whatever is done, what is doing now clearly doesn't work. It's gotten worse. And at some point, the West is going to go too far, and there's going to be no alternative to Russia than to take a more major kind of a response. And that's where the danger is. So I think you have to stop it before we get at that point, because you know, as hard as life can be, it's still nice to be alive. And if a war breaks out, it will be nuclear, and that will be the end of us all. So that's my assessment. I've been thinking long and hard about this, and it seems to me that the Kremlin strategy is a failure.
Concerning your first recommendation to ignore the West and maybe the United States, currently both our respective ambassadors are home. Should we lower the diplomatic representation? I mean, should we keep the ambassadors home and maybe just keep ministers, counselors as their replacements, or maybe even lower?
Yes, yes. The ambassadors should stay at home. You know, what good does diplomatic representation with the United States do to Russia? None. The diplomatic office in Moscow essentially supports the supporters of Navalny. They funnel money in there. Russia would probably be better off if they had no representation with the United States and allowed no American officials in Russia. Because what good do? They actually support the people that give a bad impression. Now, I understand that am I pronouncing it right still? Navalny? That group is minuscule. The man has hardly any influence in Russia. But what the American newspapers say, they show the protest, and they have created the impression of this man as the legitimate democratic leader of Russia. Just like they tried to do with the person we tried to put in place of Maduro in Venezuela. So this guy who has no support, from the standpoint of the New York Times, he's the real person the Russians support. Look at the demonstrations, you see Russia's for him, and Putin is an authoritarian, he's suppressing democracy. So, you know, the Kremlin may see him as no threat, but the way it's portrayed here, it hurts the Kremlin badly. So really, all this kid gloves treatment of Navalny is a mistake, because look how long he's been there. Look, you know, I was thinking, why in the world did the Kremlin let this guy go out to Germany to be tested? Didn't they know what was going to happen in advance? You had to know. And moreover, why would you admit that your medical doctors were worse than the Germans, or not as good as the Germans? It makes no sense. It's almost like we've got to show the world how democratic and open-minded we are. Well, it's not working because the world doesn't care, because the world is governed by the American demand for American hegemony. It's not anything that depends on how democratic Russia is. Russia is in the way. That's the issue. And until the Russians understand this, they keep making these mistakes that we use for propaganda to set them up. So if you go ask an American today, oh, Russia, oh yeah, Putin, he's awful, he's a killer. Oh, he's suppressing democracy. He tried to kill the legitimate leader. This is the stuff they believe, and this is all because the Kremlin can't understand how to manage the propaganda, and so they keep producing case after case for the Washington to use against them. That's the real danger in this situation. This is why they're better off just breaking off relations. If they want to have business relations with Europe, fine, but they should just not bother with any kind of diplomatic relations with the United States, because it works against Russia. And that means a greater likelihood of war.
Okay, sir, it was a pleasure and an honor for me to ask you questions today. And we barely touched our bilateral relations, or discussion of our bilateral relations. And it is my hope that we will continue to discuss the issues that are of importance for both our countries. Thank you very much, sir.
Yes, well, thank you. And I think you're correct that these issues are worthy of far more discussion than they get.